She handed my chair to a stranger at my own birthday party and told me I could sit anywhere I liked. So I picked up the envelope that the whole room had been waiting for me to open, tucked it under my arm, and walked out the front door without saying a single word. I heard someone call my name from behind me. I did not turn around. I just kept walking, the evening air cool against my face, the gravel crunching under my heels, the sound of my own footsteps, the only music I needed. There is a lesson buried in what happened that night, and I want you to understand it before I tell you anything else. Love, the real and lasting kind, does not demand that you make yourself small in order to be welcomed. It does not ask you to stand at the edge of your own life, smiling politely while someone else occupies the center. The moment you accept that arrangement, even once, even for the sake of keeping the peace, you teach everyone around you that your comfort is negotiable. And once they learn that lesson, they never unlearn it on their own. My name is Margaret Elaine Caldwell. I am 66 years old. I have been a widow for 4 years, and I own my home, my time, and my decisions entirely. The night of my birthday party was the night I stopped negotiating. If any part of what I am about to share sounds familiar to you, if you have ever sat in a room full of people who claimed to love you and still felt invisible, then I want you to stay with me until the very end. Every story I tell on this channel comes from a real place, and every lesson I share is one I paid for personally. If this one speaks to you, leave me a comment below. Tell me your version of this story. I read every single one, and I want to hear yours. And if no one in your life is saying these things out loud, then let this channel be the place where you hear them. I live in a cream-colored craftsman house on a quarter-acre lot at the end of a gravel lane in a town small enough that the neighbors still wave when you drive past. My husband, Gerald, built the back porch himself over one long summer 14 years ago. He built it wide enough for 2 rocking chairs and a small table between them. And for years, we sat out there every evening from about 5 o'clock until the light disappeared. When Gerald died, I thought I would never be able to sit on that porch again without the grief becoming unbearable. I was wrong about that, the way you are wrong about a lot of things when you are in the middle of the worst chapter of your life. Now I sit there alone most mornings with a cup of coffee, and I am not unhappy. I am quiet in the way that only people who have survived something understand. I retired from my position as a hospital administrator 16 months before the birthday party. I had spent 31 years managing other people's crises, other people's schedules, other people's emotions. The retirement felt at first like something was missing from my chest, a hollow where the purpose used to be. Then it felt like breathing for the first time. I planted a kitchen garden. I started taking walks in the afternoon instead of eating lunch at my desk. I read books from beginning to end without falling asleep before the 3rd chapter. I learned what I actually liked for breakfast when no one was telling me where I needed to be in 40 minutes. My finances were what a financial advisor would politely call comfortable. Gerald's life insurance, combined with my pension and the paid-off mortgage, meant that I did not need to ask anyone for anything. That is important to understand. The house was mine. The savings were mine. The decisions were mine. I was not dependent on my son or on anyone else, and I had not been for a long time. I was sitting on the back porch that particular morning, the one that started the day that eventually ended with me walking out of my own birthday party. It was the 2nd week of October, and the maple in the back corner of the yard had gone the color of an old flame, orange and deep red, all mixed together, branches catching the early light, in a way that made you want to stop talking and just look. The coffee was good. The air had that specific October quality, cool and faintly sweet, the kind of morning that in any other context would have felt like a gift. My son Daniel's car pulled into the drive at 8:43. I know the exact time because I had just checked my watch to see whether I had enough time for a second cup before my walk. He came around the side of the house rather than ringing the front bell, which told me this was not a brief errand. Daniel has always been the kind of man who enters a room the long way when he wants something. It gives him time to compose whatever he plans to say. He said good morning and sat in Gerald's chair without asking. He has done that since his father died, and I have never mentioned it, which is probably its own kind of mistake. Daniel is 41 years old. He is my only child, and I love him in the permanent, bone-deep way that mothers love their children, even when they are enormously disappointed in them. He married Renata 9 years ago. I will tell you more about Renata in a moment. That morning, sitting in Gerald's chair with his coffee mug that he had helped himself to from my kitchen, Daniel told me that Renata had been planning a birthday party for me, that it would be at the house this coming Saturday, that she had already invited people and arranged for catering, and that I just needed to be there by 6:30 and look happy. He said it exactly like that, look happy. I set my coffee cup down on the small table and looked at the maple tree for a moment. Then I thanked him and said it sounded like a lot of effort. He seemed relieved that I had not made it complicated. He finished his coffee, told me he loved me, and left before 9:15. I sat on the porch for another hour after that, watching the maple tree and thinking about patterns. The dynamic between Renata and me did not begin as a bad one. I want to be accurate about that. In the early years of her marriage to Daniel, Renata was simply someone I did not know well, a woman with sharp opinions and a great deal of energy, who organized things with a thoroughness that I generally respected. We were not close. We are very different people. But there was a version of our relationship in those early years that functioned adequately, the way two people can share space and occasional meals without either genuine warmth or genuine conflict. The shift happened so gradually that I cannot point to one single moment as the turning point. It was more like watching water slowly change the shape of a stone. What I can tell you is that by the third or fourth year of their marriage, a certain posture had developed. Renata had learned, through my consistent accommodation, that I would absorb the inconvenience of her decisions without complaint. I would adjust my plans. I would offer my resources. I would be flexible where she was rigid and generous where she was calculating and quiet where she was loud. And because I kept doing those things, she came to expect them. Not with any particular cruelty. I do not think Renata sat at her kitchen table and made deliberate plans to exploit me. It was subtler than that. Entitlement rarely announces itself. It tends to grow in the silence between what is asked and what is never refused. The first time I remember being conscious of the imbalance was Thanksgiving, 3 years into the marriage. Daniel and Renata announced they would host at their apartment that year. Then they called 2 weeks before the holiday to let me know the apartment was being painted and could they come to my house instead. I said, of course. Could I also do most of the cooking since they both had difficult weeks ahead at work? Yes, naturally. Could I buy the turkey and a few sides since money was tight that month? Yes, of course. They arrived on Thanksgiving afternoon with a bottle of wine and Renata's sister, who had not been mentioned. They left without helping with the dishes. I told myself it was fine. It was Thanksgiving. Family is complicated. The Christmas after Gerald died, Renata asked if she and Daniel could stay at my house for the week between Christmas and New Year's. I said yes immediately because I was newly widowed and the company sounded better than the silence. They stayed for 12 days. They slept in the master bedroom because their own room was too small, they said. And besides, they assumed I wasn't comfortable there anymore, which is the kind of assumption that tells you everything about a person. Renata rearranged my kitchen. She moved things to different cabinets because the layout wasn't intuitive, she explained, and she wanted to be helpful. I came downstairs one morning and could not find my own coffee mugs. I found them eventually in a low cabinet near the floor, behind a stack of serving bowls I had owned for 20 years. I did not say anything. I was grieving. I told myself it was a bad time to make issues out of small things. But here is what I know now that I did not know then. When you tell yourself it is a bad time to draw a boundary, it is always a bad time. There is always a reason to wait. There is always something fragile in the room that you don't want to break. And so the line keeps moving inch by inch until one day you look around and realize that what you thought was a line has become a hallway that other people walk through at will. What changed in my life in the months before my birthday was a combination of things. Retirement meant I no longer had a professional identity that required performance. I didn't need to be agreeable or strategic or diplomatically patient. I was just Margaret, 66 years old, sitting on her back porch with a cup of coffee and no particular reason to pretend. Gerald's death had stripped away a kind of social scaffolding. The role of wife, of the couple at the party, of the person someone else was always looking for in a room. When you lose that, you either dissolve or you crystallize. I had taken 4 years to crystallize. By the October of my birthday, I was entirely clear about what I was and what I was not willing to absorb any further. Renata arrived at my house Thursday morning, 2 days before the party, to, as she put it, get things organized. She had a tote bag full of paper supplies, plates and napkins in shades of champagne and gold that she had chosen herself, and a notepad with a list written in her distinctive, narrow handwriting. She walked through the front door without knocking. She had been doing that for years. She told me that the party would be for approximately 30 people. I had not been informed of a number until that moment. She told me the caterer would arrive Saturday at 4 to set up, and they would need access to the kitchen and the dining room and possibly the back porch. She told me that she had assigned a specific seat for me at the head table, and that the evening would follow an itinerary she had prepared. She then handed me a sheet of paper with the itinerary on it. My own birthday party, itineraried for my convenience by the woman who had reorganized my kitchen cabinets while I was grieving. I looked at the itinerary. There was a line item at 8:15 that read, "Margaret opens the gift envelope." I asked her what the gift envelope was. She smiled the smile of someone presenting a very generous thing. Several of the guests, she explained, had been asked to contribute to a fund for a piece of furniture for my living room, since, in her opinion, the sofa I had was getting tired. She had already picked out the sofa. It was from a store I would not have chosen. The envelope would contain the gift card. The opening of it was scheduled for 8:15, in front of the 30 guests, after the cake. I was quiet for a moment. I said that sounded like a great deal of planning. She agreed that it had been a lot of work. I thanked her and said I was looking forward to seeing everyone. She left 40 minutes later with the same energy she arrived with, and I sat down at my kitchen table after I heard her car leave and allowed myself, for the first time in a long time, to be completely still. What I felt in that moment was not quite anger. Anger is hot and this was cold. It was clarity, actually, the kind that arrives when you stop trying to explain something away and simply see it as it is. What I saw was a woman who had taken my birthday and turned it into a stage production, with herself as director and me as a prop. I was to appear at the appointed time, in the appointed chair, and open the appointed envelope containing money for a sofa she had selected, and I was to be grateful for all of it. My birthday, my house, my guests, my face, all arranged by someone else for someone else's satisfaction. The fact that it had been framed as a gift did not change the architecture of the thing. It was still a takeover. I sat at my kitchen table and I paid attention. Not for the first time, but for the first time without the numbing filter of accommodation. I paid attention to everything. The moved coffee mugs, the uninvited sister at Thanksgiving, the 12-day Christmas, the itinerary, the sofa I had not asked for, the chair that was already mine being assigned to me on a schedule. I saw the whole shape of it at once, and the shape was not complicated. It was simply a pattern of one person progressively expanding her territory into another person's life, sustained entirely by the second person's unwillingness to make things awkward. I understood that Renata had not done this out of cruelty. She had done it because I had never once shown her that any of my limits were real. Every limit I had possessed until that moment had turned out to be, upon pressure, a suggestion. I had taught her this. I had taught Daniel this. And now I was sitting in my own kitchen on a Thursday morning, being managed like a scheduled event. I would like to say something here that I believe is worth hearing, especially if you are somewhere in the middle of a similar pattern and trying to name what is happening to you. What Renata had been doing has a name in psychology. Therapists sometimes call it entitlement expansion, the gradual process by which a person who is never refused begins to experience another person's resources, space, and compliance as their natural right. It does not begin with malice. It begins with a small ask that is met with generosity. Then the next ask is slightly larger, calibrated just below the level that would provoke refusal. Over time, the asks expand and the line of what is acceptable shifts outward, invisibly, until the person on the receiving end is accommodating things they never consciously agreed to. The accommodated person often doesn't realize how far the line has moved until something stops them cold. For me, it was an itinerary. And here's something I want you to know as well, in case you need to hear it stated plainly. Your home is your property. If you own the home in which you live, you have the legal and moral authority to determine who enters it, under what conditions, and for how long. You can add locks. You can close rooms. You can rescind standing invitations. You can change a code or a key without anyone's permission but your own. None of those actions require explanation or apology. The law in virtually every jurisdiction in this country recognizes the homeowner's right to determine access to their property. Family relationships exist alongside that right, not above it. No one is entitled to access to your home simply because they share your name or your history. Your house is not a community resource. It is yours. I thought about this for a long time on Thursday afternoon. Then I made some decisions. The party was Saturday at 6:30. On Friday morning, I drove to the hardware store and bought 2 new padlocks. I installed one on the door to the primary bedroom. I installed one on the door to the small room off the dining room that Gerald had used as a study and that I had converted, after his death, into a sitting room where I kept my books, my desk, and certain private things. I also changed the code on the garage keypad to a number that no one else knew. These were all spaces that Renata had, over the years, begun to treat as available to her. The garage, in particular, she had used as storage for seasonal items she didn't have room for in her and Daniel's house. Items that were, I realized as I thought about it Friday, still in my garage without my having been asked. I didn't call Daniel to explain. I didn't text Renata. I simply installed the padlocks, changed the code, and went back inside to make a proper lunch for myself, which I ate at my kitchen table in complete quiet. In the afternoon, I moved certain things from the main refrigerator into the small secondary refrigerator I had bought a few months prior and kept in the laundry room. The food I had purchased for myself, the things I actually wanted to eat, the specific brand of yogurt and the particular kind of cheese that I liked and the good olives. I left the main refrigerator stocked with basics. I was not going to leave my own house empty before my own birthday party, but I was also no longer going to make all of my personal provisions available by default to people who had not been invited to help themselves. When the caterer arrived Saturday at 4, I showed them the kitchen and the dining room and the back porch. I was perfectly pleasant. I answered their questions. I helped them understand how the space worked. I was not unkind or difficult. I was simply myself, in my own house, being a reasonable host. By 6 o'clock, the back porch and the dining room had been transformed with small white lights and flowers in glass vases and the champagne and gold paper goods from Renata's tote bag, and I had to admit that visually the effect was quite lovely. Whatever else could be said about Renata, she had good instincts for staging. I dressed carefully that evening. I wore the dark green dress I had bought myself for a friend's retirement dinner the previous spring, and the amber earrings that Gerald had given me on our 30th anniversary. I sat at my vanity mirror and took my time. I was calm in the way you are calm when you have already decided what you are going to do, and the only remaining question is the execution. The guests began arriving at 6:30. Many of them were old friends of mine. Women from the hospital where I'd worked, couples from the neighborhood, 2 friends from my book club, my friend Patricia, who drove 40 minutes from the next town and brought me a lavender plant wrapped in brown paper. There were also a number of people I'd never met, which I understood to mean they were Renata's guests. I did not say anything about that. I greeted everyone at the door and thanked them for coming, and I meant it. Whatever was about to happen had nothing to do with these people. Renata was magnificent in her element. She circulated and directed and arranged people with the confidence of someone who has thrown 100 parties and enjoyed each one. She wore a fitted ivory blouse, and she had done something architectural with her hair. She was objectively doing a very capable job of hosting. The food was good. The caterers were efficient and quiet. People were drinking and talking, and the sound of 30 voices in my house had a warmth to it that surprised me with how much I didn't hate it. At about 7:15, Renata guided me to the head table with a light hand on my arm and showed me to my seat. It was a beautiful seat. The chair at the center, framed on either side by vases of white roses and small candles. My name was on a card in front of it, in Renata's handwriting, slanted and confident. I sat down. I was introduced to the 2 people on either side of me. One of them was Renata's colleague, a woman in her 40s named Bev. The other was Bev's husband. They were perfectly nice. I had never met either of them in my life. At 7:30, Renata came and whispered something in Bev's ear. Bev nodded and stood up. Renata then bent down to me with a bright smile and told me that actually she had forgotten that she'd promised Bev's seat to someone else. Her friend Carolyn was coming in from out of town, and Carolyn and Bev always sat together, so could I just. And she gestured in a small, elegant way at the rest of the table. Sit anywhere? I looked at her. She was still smiling. There was no recognition in her eyes of what she had just said or done. None at all. She had looked at the card with my name on it at my birthday party at my house and decided that it was negotiable because something else had come up. Could I just sit anywhere? I said, "Of course. Give me just one moment." I reached across the table and picked up the gift envelope, the one that said, "For Margaret" on the front in gold lettering, the one with the gift card inside for the sofa I had not asked for, the one that was scheduled to be opened at 8:15 in front of 30 people according to the itinerary. I picked it up and put it in my small evening bag, and I stood up. Renata was already moving across the room toward Carolyn. She had not watched me stand. She had not seen me take the envelope. No one had. I stopped at the door to the kitchen and looked back at the room for a moment. The white lights were beautiful. The roses were beautiful. Patricia was laughing at something the woman from my book club had said. Everything looked lovely and warm, and I felt something clarify inside me, the way a photograph clarifies when you finally get the focus right. Then I walked to the front door, opened it, and left. The gravel was cool under my heels. I walked to my car, which was parked at the far end of the drive because the catering van had taken the center space. I got in. I started the engine. I drove to a diner that is open until 11, and I sat in a corner booth and ordered a piece of lemon meringue pie and a cup of decaf coffee, and I stayed there for 2 hours. My phone began ringing at 7:47. Daniel first, then Renata, then Daniel again. I put the phone face down on the table and ate my pie, which was very good. Patricia texted to say she hoped I was all right. I texted her back to say I was completely fine, eating pie, and that I would call her in the morning. She replied with a heart emoji, which is the entire reason Patricia has been my friend for 30 years. I want to pause here and say something about the nature of my decision that evening, because I think it is easy to misread a choice like this as dramatic or impulsive or even passive-aggressive. It was none of those things. I left my birthday party not because I was hurt, though I was, and not because I wanted to make a scene, because the whole point was that I specifically wanted to avoid making a scene. I left because staying would have required me to sit in a chair I was handed as a consolation while 30 people watched me open a gift card for a sofa I had not chosen, in a narrative Renata had scripted from beginning to end. Leaving was the only honest option. It was also, as it turned out, the most powerful thing I could have done, precisely because it was quiet. When you remove yourself from a situation, instead of fighting for your position within it, you make something clear that fighting never could. You make clear that you do not need the room. And once that is clear, once the person who has been counting on your need for the room understands that the need is gone, every calculation they have made about your compliance must be revised. I drove home at 10:15. The caterers had gone. The guests had gone. The lights on the back porch had been turned off, and the house was dark except for the front porch light, which I had left on for myself. Daniel's car was in the driveway. He was sitting on the front steps. He had his jacket on over his dinner clothes, and he looked like a man who had been sitting in the cold for a while and knew he deserved it. I walked past him and unlocked the front door and went inside and put my evening bag on the counter and turned on the kitchen light. He came in after me. I put the kettle on because I wanted a proper cup of tea, and I had not wanted to ask for it at the diner. He said, "Mom." I said, "I know." He said, "She didn't mean—" I turned around from the stove and looked at him. Not angrily, just directly. I said, "Daniel, I know you believe that, but I need you to think about what she did. She came to my birthday party, in my house, and gave away the seat with my name on it, to one of her friends, in front of 30 people. And then she told me I could sit anywhere." He was quiet. I said, "I want you to think about the last 9 years, not to punish yourself, just to see the pattern clearly. Every Christmas at this house, the garage, which currently contains 4 storage bins that belong to Renata and have been there for 2 years without anyone asking me. The kitchen cabinets she reorganized while your father was barely cold. The birthday party I was not consulted about, for which I was handed an itinerary." I let each of those words sit in the air for a moment. She did not mean to be cruel. I am not calling her cruel. I am telling you that the sum of all of those things is not acceptable, and I am done pretending otherwise. He said, What? What does that mean? I said, It means things are going to be different. He opened his mouth and then closed it. He sat down at the kitchen table in the chair closest to him, which happened to be the one he'd sat in since he was 7 years old. For a moment, in the kitchen light, he looked exactly like the boy he had been, worried and not sure what the rules were. I felt something steady and sad at the same time. I loved my son entirely. That was not the question. The question was what love actually required of me and what it did not. I said, I am not angry at you, but I need you to hear me when I tell you that this house is the only thing in my life that is entirely mine. Your father and I built 31 years of our life here. I have lived here alone for 4 years. No one has the right to walk through this door as though they own it, rearrange it, store things in it, or seat me in it according to a schedule. Not Renata and not anyone else. That is not coldness. That is simply what is true. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said that he understood. I do not know how much of that was true and how much of it was exhaustion. But he said it. And then he went home, and I drank my tea on the back porch in the dark and listened to the quiet, which was the best birthday present I had received all day. The next 2 weeks were not peaceful in the external sense, though I was peaceful enough inside them. On Monday, I discovered that a recurring grocery order I had set up, one I had, without quite examining why, been having delivered to Daniel and Renata's address for the past year and a half, had been running on a card connected to my primary account. I have no clear recollection of agreeing to this arrangement. I believe it began at a point during the pandemic when they were not going out, and I had offered to help for a month or two, and the month or two had simply never ended because I had never ended it. The amount per delivery was not enormous. The principle of it was. I called my bank on Monday morning and separated the card from the account. I set up a new account for my personal expenses with a new card and a new number, which I did not share with anyone. I canceled the grocery delivery to their address with a note through the service saying the order was no longer needed. On Tuesday, I opened my email and found a statement from an insurance company showing that Daniel's car, not Renata's, Daniel's, was listed under my homeowner's policy as a bundled vehicle, a bundling that had apparently begun 3 years ago when Daniel had mentioned, casually, that bundling would save us both money. The savings had gone to him. The premium had come from me. I called the insurance company and removed the vehicle from the policy. The representative walked me through it with professional efficiency. The whole call took 11 minutes. I did not call Daniel to tell him either of these things in advance. I felt that the call he made to me was the relevant one, and it had happened on Saturday night when he had come to my front steps. On Wednesday, Renata called me. I let it go to voicemail. The message she left was careful and even. She was sorry if the seating situation had upset me. She had not meant any offense. She hoped I understood she had put a great deal of effort into the evening. There was no acknowledgement in the message of anything she had actually done. There was only the offer of her own good intentions as a kind of full exculpation. I listened to the message once, and then I did not call back. On Thursday, Daniel called to tell me that Renata had found out about the insurance change and the grocery cancellation. His voice had an aggrieved quality that I recognized from his childhood, the specific tone of someone who has discovered that consequences are real and is not pleased about it. He said she was very upset. He said it seemed retaliatory. He asked if I couldn't have talked to them first. I said, Daniel, those were my accounts and my policies. I reorganized them, that's all. He said, she's really upset, Mom. I said, I understand that. I am not trying to hurt Renata. But these are my finances, and I needed to put them in order. That should have been done a long time ago. There was a silence on the line. He said, she says she feels like you're punishing her for trying to do something nice for you. I said, I know that's how she sees it. I hope someday she sees it differently. I ended the call kindly, and I meant that too. I did not blame Renata for having the feelings she had. Losing a resource you have come to regard as yours always feels like an attack, even when it is simply a withdrawal. The car arrangement came to light 10 days after the party, in a way I had not anticipated, but probably should have. Daniel drove my second car, a small sedan I almost never used anymore, to his office whenever his own vehicle needed service, And he had been doing this so routinely and for so long that his parking permit at work was registered under my car's license plate. I discovered this because I finally decided for the first time in years to take the sedan in for a maintenance checkup, and the service manager mentioned that the vehicle had considerably more highway miles than I had expected. I looked at the odometer number for a moment. Then I did the arithmetic. I said nothing to the service manager. I drove home, took the spare key off the hook inside my kitchen cabinet where it had lived for 20 years, and put it in the drawer of my bedside table. I did not call Daniel about the key. 3 days later, he showed up at my door and said he had needed the car and the key wasn't in the cabinet. I told him I'd moved it. He asked where. I said it was with my things. He looked at me for a moment with the expression of a man encountering a wall where there used to be a door. He said that had been a pretty convenient arrangement for both of us. I said I understood that, and that the arrangement had changed. He said, "Mom, you're going to make things really difficult." I said, "I don't mean to make anything difficult. I mean to make things accurate. There's a difference." He stood at my front door in his coat, and he looked at me, and I looked back at him, and I thought about 31 years of quiet generosity that had been absorbed so completely it had become invisible. And I thought about Gerald's chair on the porch, and I thought about the morning after the party when I had sat outside in the dark with my tea and felt for the first time in years the full dimensions of my own peace. 2 weeks after the birthday party, Renata's brother Martin came to my house unannounced on a Saturday morning. He rang the bell properly, which I noted as a distinction from his sister, and I answered the door in my robe and garden gloves because I had been outside pulling the last of the summer herbs before the hard frost came. Martin is 10 years younger than Renata, which makes him around 35. He is pleasant in the way of people who have learned to use pleasantness as a tool. He has a wide smile and he talks about everything he is planning to do in a way that suggests he finds plans more satisfying than follow through. He said he'd come to check in on me. Family is family, and that he had heard about the situation and hoped things were okay. I invited him in for coffee because refusing felt unnecessarily hostile and because I was curious about what the visit actually was. I made the coffee and set it on the kitchen table, and he sat across from me and talked for about 10 minutes about how much he cared about family relationships and how important it was that we all support each other and how he hoped I wasn't feeling too isolated, living alone and all. Then he said that he knew I was in a comfortable position financially and that he had been having a difficult year and that he and his girlfriend were thinking of buying a place together, but the down payment was the obstacle, and he wondered whether I had ever thought about what my wishes were regarding my estate, because he knew I would want to make sure the people I loved were taken care of before things happened. He said before things happened. He meant before I died. He was sitting at my kitchen table at 10:15 on a Saturday morning in October, asking me, while dressed in the language of concern, for an early portion of my estate. I was 66 years old and in good health, and he was asking me to consider giving him money because his down payment was difficult. I drank my coffee. I set the mug down. I said, "Martin, I appreciate you coming. I want to be honest with you because I think honesty serves us better than courtesy in this particular conversation. My finances are not a family fund. They are mine. They were accumulated through my work and my late husband's work over the course of our lives, and they are for my use in my lifetime. I have no plans to distribute anything in advance, and if I did have such plans, they would not be a matter I'd discuss over an unannounced Saturday morning visit. I say that without any unkindness toward you. I hope things get easier, and I hope you'll tell Renata I said hello." He took a breath and held onto the pleasant expression with some effort and said he understood and that he hadn't meant to make me uncomfortable. I said he hadn't. I showed him to the door. I showed. I watched his car leave from the front window, and then I went back to the garden. I want to say something here that I think is important for anyone who is in the second half of their life and owns anything of value. Your savings, your home equity, your pension, your inheritance from your own parents. None of it becomes community property the moment you enter a family. The emotional pressure to share your resources, to enable your children or their spouses to provide what someone has decided they are entitled to, that pressure is real and it can be relentless. But your financial security is not selfishness. It is your independence, and it is the thing that protects you from becoming dependent on the very people who are asking you to give it away. You have earned the right to spend your resources on yourself, to make your own decisions about your own money, and to refuse any request from any person without explanation or apology. Your nest egg is not a guilt offering. 3 weeks after the party, I came home from a book club meeting to find that something had changed in the spare bedroom. I knew it the moment I walked down the hall. The door was ajar. I always leave it fully closed. And when I pushed it open, the overhead light was on. Someone had been in the room. Renata had been in the room. I knew this because the closet was open, and several of the items hanging in it had been shifted to one side, making space. On the closet floor, neatly lined up, were 3 pairs of shoes I had never seen before, and on the single empty shelf at eye level, a small arrangement of cosmetic items in a toiletry bag. I stood in the doorway for a long moment. Then I took the cosmetic bag off the shelf and placed it carefully in the hallway. I picked up each pair of shoes individually and placed them in the hallway next to the bag. I closed the closet. I turned off the light. I closed the door fully. I went to my own room and removed from my bedside drawer the spare front door key that I had thought was unaccounted for. There were only 2, and I had both. And I understood from the absence of any other explanation that someone had had a copy made at some point. I did not know when. The next morning, I called a locksmith. He arrived by noon and changed both the front and back door locks. I had the new keys in my hand by 1 o'clock. I did not distribute them to anyone. At 4 o'clock, Renata arrived at my front door and her key did not work. She rang the bell. I answered. She said, "The lock is different." I said, "Yes." She said, "Margaret." She used my name the way people use names when they want to suggest that you are being unreasonable. I just came to get a few things. I said, "Renata, I want to understand something. When did you move items into the spare room?" She looked at me steadily for a moment. Then she said that she and Daniel had been discussing the possibility of needing a place to stay temporarily while their apartment lease was renegotiated. And she had just thought ahead. She had not meant anything by it. I said, "You put things in a room in my house without asking me." She said, "I thought we were past the point of needing to ask." I looked at her. I took a breath. I said, "That is the most clarifying thing you have said to me in 9 years. We are not past that point. We were never past that point. Your items are in the hallway. Come in and collect them." She came in. She collected them. She stood at the front door with the shoes in one hand and the toiletry bag under her arm, and she looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her before. Not anger, not contempt. Something closer to recognition. As though she had finally understood that the door she thought she had been walking through was in fact a door that I owned. She said, "I have put a lot of effort into this family." I said, "I know you have, and I have as well. The difference is that I'm no longer going to allow the effort to be a reason for the boundary not to exist." She left without responding to that. I closed the door and stood in the front hallway for a moment, and I heard myself breathe. I did not know it at the time, but that was the last conversation Renata and I had that followed the old architecture of our relationship. The one where I was the adjustable element and she was the fixed one. The following week, Daniel called me and the call was different from the others. The aggrieved tone was gone. What replaced it was something flatter and more honest, which I appreciated even though it was hard to hear. He said that he and Renata had been arguing. He said she was angry at him for not siding with her more forcefully, and he was angry at her for having put shoes in his mother's closet without a conversation. He said he had not known about the closet. I believed him about that. He said, "I don't know how we got here." I said, "I do. But this is not the moment for that conversation. What I want you to hear right now is that I love you, and none of what has changed between me and Renata changes that. You are my son. You are welcome in this house whenever you want to come, with appropriate notice like a grown adult. But Renata needs to understand that the terms of her relationship with this house and with me are going to be different, and those are my terms to set." He said, "What does that look like?" I said, "It looks like asking. It looks like knocking. It looks like treating what is mine as something that has a boundary around it, the same way you would treat any other person's property and space." There was a long pause. He said, "She's threatening to go stay at her sister's." I said, "Then she should go to her sister's, if she needs space to think." He said, Mom. I said, Daniel, I am not asking her to leave your marriage. I am asking both of you to respect a boundary in a relationship with me. If she cannot do that, then yes, everyone needs space to think. That is not my ultimatum. That is just how boundaries work. 3 days later, Renata did go to her sister's. Not for good. I want to be accurate about what happened, but for a week. She and Daniel were in what I can only describe as the first honest argument of their marriage, which is to say, the first one in which the resource that had been holding the unofficial peace treaty together was no longer available to paper things over. Without the car, without the accounts, without the open kitchen, and the available rooms, and the grandmother will handle it default. Without all of that, they had to look directly at each other and ask what they actually wanted from their life together. That is a useful question to be forced to ask. I did not feel guilty for having been the one who forced it because I had not forced it. I had simply removed a cushion, and it turned out that beneath the cushion there was a conversation they had been avoiding for years. I spent that particular week in something approaching contentment. I reorganized the spare room, not aggressively, just deliberately, putting it back into an order that reflected my own preferences. I moved a reading chair in from the storage area of the basement, where it had been sitting since Gerald died, and I put it by the window with a small lamp. I put books on the shelf. I put a plant on the windowsill. I made the room look like what it was, which was a room in my house that I might use in whatever way I chose. On the Saturday morning of that week, I sat in the rocking chair on the back porch with my coffee, and I watched the maple tree, which had mostly let go of its leaves by then, the branches bare against a sky that had gone the color of pewter. October had given way to early November. The yard had the stripped, clear quality of late autumn, when everything that needed to fall has fallen. And what remains is just the true shape of things. I felt something that I want to describe carefully because it has been misnamed in my own head before. It was not triumph. It was not satisfaction in the way of having won something. What it was, I think, was relief. The specific relief that comes when you have been holding a position that was never actually yours to hold. The position of person who absorbs rather than responds. And you have finally set it down. The relief of returning to your own outline. I thought about Gerald. I thought about what he would have said. He was a quiet man, quieter than me, which is saying something, and he had an extraordinary capacity for stillness in difficult moments. He used to say that the most powerful thing a person could do in a room was simply refuse to be moved by what was happening in it. I thought he had meant it as a metaphor for emotional management. Sitting on the porch that November morning, I thought perhaps he had also meant it literally. You can be present and unmoved. You can be warm and still. You can love someone fully and still require that they see you as a person with limits and not as an infinite resource. Renata came back from her sister's after 8 days. She and Daniel had talked, apparently at some length, and with more honesty than they were accustomed to. Daniel called me to say that Renata wanted to come and speak to me. I said that was fine. I said to come in the afternoon and to ring the bell. They came together on a Wednesday. I made tea because it gives your hand something useful to do during a difficult conversation, and because the ritual of it slows everything down to a more manageable pace. We sat in the living room, which has always been the formal room in this house, the one with the good chairs and the old photographs on the mantel. I chose it deliberately because I wanted the conversation to feel like what it was, an honest discussion between adults, and not like a kitchen table family negotiation. Renata sat with her hands in her lap and she said she was sorry. She said it without preamble, which I respected. She said she understood that she had overstepped in multiple ways over multiple years, and that she had told herself for a long time that her intentions had been good enough to excuse the overstepping. She said she understood now that intentions do not work that way. I said, I accept your apology. I want you to know that I mean that. She looked at me with something I had not seen in her eyes before. I think it was the look of a person who has been expecting to negotiate and has discovered that the person across from them is not negotiating. There is nothing more disarming than genuine acceptance. I said, and I want to be equally honest with you. Accepting your apology does not mean returning to the way things were. Some things have changed and they will stay changed. The accounts, the car, the key to the house, those are mine to manage and I will continue to manage them. The boundary around the spare room and the primary bedroom is real, and it will remain real. These aren't punishments. They are simply the accurate state of things, which they should have been all along. Renata said, "What does this mean for us going forward?" And I said, "It means we start fresh, on honest terms. You can come to this house with an invitation. You can call and ask before assuming anything here is available to you. If I invite you for a holiday, I invite you. If I don't, I don't. If either of you needs something, you can ask me and I will tell you yes or no. Those are very reasonable terms for any relationship between adults." Daniel said, "And if we need a place to stay, temporarily, honestly, actually need it," I said, "then you call and you ask and I consider it. That is the appropriate process. What is not appropriate is a closet with shoes in it that arrive before the conversation." Renata almost smiled at that. I did not dislike her in that moment. I have never quite disliked her. She is a person who expanded into available space because available space was offered. What she had not learned until now was that every space has an owner, and the owner's consent is not a formality. I told them I expected Daniel, not Renata, to manage any future coordination with me directly. Not because Renata and I could not speak, we clearly could, but because Daniel had, for 9 years, positioned himself as someone who simply inherited the results of other people's decisions, and that was going to change. He was my son. His relationship with this house and with me was his to maintain or not, and it was past time for him to understand that. He nodded at that with something that looked like relief, which told me he had known it for a while, had been waiting for someone to say it plainly. They left in the late afternoon. I stood at the front door and watched them walk to the car, and I felt the odd tenderness of watching your child navigate the actual complexity of being an adult and knowing that you cannot make it easier for them and that it is not your job to. I gave Daniel 8 weeks. That is what I told him when I called him the following day with a clear head and a fully prepared mind. 8 weeks from that date for them to identify alternative arrangements if they intended to renegotiate their lease rather than renew it. I said this was not a punishment and not an eviction because they did not currently live with me. What it was, I said, was clarity. If they were thinking about a transition period that involved my house, I wanted them to know that any such arrangement would need to be discussed, agreed upon in writing, defined in terms of duration and terms, and treated as a guest arrangement, not a family entitlement. I said I would consider such a request if it came through the proper channel, which was a real conversation with both of them present in advance, not a closet with shoes in it. Daniel said, "That's fair." I said, "I know." He called me 3 weeks later to say that they had renewed the lease. He said it matter-of-factly, without drama, as though it were simply a logistical update, which is exactly what it was. I said that sounded like a good decision and asked how he was doing, and we talked for 20 minutes about something other than any of this, and it was the most natural conversation we had had in years. That is what honest terms do. They clear the air of performance. In December, Daniel came alone one Sunday afternoon. He called first. He rang the bell. He brought a small poinsettia because it was December and he knew I liked them. And he sat at the kitchen table and we had lunch together, and he told me about work and about a trip he and Renata were thinking of taking in the spring. And he asked me directly whether I would like to join them for a few days if the dates worked. Not whether I could plan the trip or fund it or host the packing beforehand, whether I would like to join them. I said I would think about it. He smiled. It was a real smile, not a managed one. He looked like himself in the way that I had been waiting for years to see him look. After he left, I sat for a long time in the kitchen with the last of the tea, and I thought about what had changed. Not just the practical things, the accounts and the locks in the car, but something structural. Some rearrangement of the architecture of how I was understood in my own family. For a long time, I had been understood as a given, as a permanent, accessible resource with no edges. Now I had edges. And oddly, paradoxically, I think I became more real to Daniel once my edges were visible. You cannot love a person properly if you cannot locate where they end. A person without limits is not a presence. They are a backdrop. There is something I learned about myself in all of this that I did not expect to learn. I had thought, for most of my adult life, that my generosity was simply my nature, that I gave because giving was who I was. What I discovered in the months after that birthday party was that a significant portion of what I called generosity was actually avoidance. I gave to avoid conflict. I gave to avoid the discomfort of being seen as difficult. I gave because the alternative, saying no, drawing a line, making the room temporarily uncomfortable, felt worse than whatever was being asked of me. That is not generosity. That is fear dressed in a generous costume. Genuine generosity is what you offer from fullness, freely, without resentment, to someone who has not arranged their life around the assumption of receiving it. What I had been practicing was something else entirely. A kind of preemptive self-erasure designed to keep the peace at the cost of my own edges. I had been so concerned with not being the difficult one that I had quietly made myself the compliant one. And then I had called it love. It is not love. It is a very understandable coping strategy that becomes, over time, a trap. And the only way out of the trap is to say no, quietly and clearly, and then to stand in the temporary discomfort of having said it and to wait on the other side of it for things to settle into their actual shape. Things do settle. It takes longer than you'd like. But they settle, and what you find on the other side is something you recognize, something you had lost so gradually you had stopped noticing its absence. You find yourself. I turned 67 in April. No one planned a party for me. Daniel called in the morning and asked if he could take me to dinner, somewhere I actually wanted to go, and he asked me where that was. I said the Italian place on the corner of Main and Broad Street, the one that makes the risotto the way I have always liked it, which is to say properly, which requires patience that most kitchens don't have. He said perfect, and we went. And it was. Renata came as well, and she was different in a way that was hard to name precisely. Quieter in my direction, more careful, genuinely curious when she asked questions, rather than simply filling space with the appearance of interest. I do not think we will ever be close, but there was something present in the room that evening that had not been there before. A kind of basic, honest acknowledgement of limits that is actually the only foundation anything real can be built on. She gave me a card. Inside it, she had written, "I am still learning what it means to be part of this family, and I am sorry it took me this long." That was all. It was, in its way, more than I had expected from her, and more than enough. I drove home alone that night because I had driven myself, which is something I will always choose when I can. The April air was cool and clear, and the town was quiet at that hour, the streetlights making pools of gold on the road ahead. And I felt, in the simple, uncomplicated forward motion of driving my own car, through my own town, toward my own house, a happiness so ordinary and so complete that I didn't need to name it. I just let it be what it was. What I learned, in the end, is something I have been trying to find the right words for since it started. Here is the closest I can get. Dignity is not something other people give you. It is not something you receive when they finally decide to treat you well, or something restored when they apologize, or something granted by a party or a seat at a table with your name on it. Dignity is what you maintain or fail to maintain by what you allow. Every time you accept an arrangement that diminishes you, you participate in the diminishment. Every time you absorb a violation to keep the peace, you are the one who pays for the peace, and the price comes out of you. And eventually, if you keep paying, what is taken from you is not just comfort or convenience. It is the clear sense of where you begin and where you end. It is the belief that your own house, your own table, your own birthday belongs to you. I had that belief restored to me the night I picked up an envelope at my own birthday party and walked out the front door. Not because leaving was dramatic, but because leaving was honest. I did not need that room. I did not need to perform gratitude for arrangements I had not agreed to, in a chair I had been handed like a consolation, at a party that had been designed from beginning to end to be about someone else's management of my life. I needed my pie and my quiet and the gravel under my heels and the clear evening air. And those were all things I already had. Family love, the real and lasting kind that actually holds up under the weight of real life, is not diminished by limits. It is defined by them. The people who love you properly are not threatened by your no. They are not surprised to learn that you have preferences about your own home and your own money and your own time. They do not require you to be limitless in order to feel loved. They simply love you within the honest architecture of a relationship where both people's edges are respected. That is the only kind of love that is actually sustainable, and it is the only kind I am interested in from here on out. Your peace is not a room you share with everyone who asks. It is the house itself, and you hold the only key. If any part of this story felt familiar to you, I want you to know that you are not alone in it. These conversations happen in kitchens and hallways and front porches all over the world between people who love each other imperfectly and are trying to figure out how to do it more honestly. If you are somewhere in the middle of a pattern like this and you are not sure where the line is, I hope this helped you see it a little more clearly. Leave me a comment below. I want to know where you are in your story, and I want you to know that someone is listening. If this is the kind of conversation you want to keep having, then subscribe because there is more where this came from. Every story I share here is about the same thing. Underneath, the right to take up the space that is yours and to hold the door of your own life with your own hand. You have earned that right. Don't give it away.